In this video, I want to explore the idea of life after death. I've had a few emails recently which I will go into and explore some of the questions that came up in those emails, but it seems a lot of people are interested in my perspective personally on the idea of life after death. Does life after death exist, and do out-of-body experiences support the idea of life after death? So that's what I'm going to be exploring in this video. So to start off with, I think that the notion of life after death needs to be explored in terms of what we actually mean. There's a lot of differences in terms of descriptions. If we go to Buddhist literature, for example, we'll see one concept or idea of what happens immediately after we die. Ideas like going through certain trials and tribulations. Then we have things like the life review, which we see a lot in near-death experience accounts. Even in my own shared death experience, there is a sense of the people that I witnessed in that experience going through some kind of life review. If you're not familiar with that case, I will link an article about it in the description. So basically, there's this sense that we hear different descriptions of what it might be. I guess in most of the religious literature, we get more of a sense, on average, of a consistent, coherent out-of-body experience that leads to a coherent, consistent afterlife. I tend to lean towards the kind of continuation of consciousness that probably exists. I'm not convinced it exists, but I think the weight of evidence, at least from areas like shared death experiences, near-death experiences, Sai, and also my own out-of-body experiences and the out-of-body experiences of others, all point towards some form of consciousness continuing. But it seems to be a somewhat more rudimentary level of consciousness. It doesn't seem to be the full multi-layered form of consciousness that we're used to in everyday life. It seems to be something different. It seems to either be a more extended, more expansive, transformative level of consciousness. That's maybe the more positive, exciting kind of idea, that consciousness is some form of fundamental state, and that in many ways the human brain is somewhat filtering that sense of consciousness down into a more basic individualistic form. But then there are ideas that once we exit the body, once we transform, once we go into the out-of-body state, or the after-death or transphysical state, as I've referred to it in my book Navigating the Out-of-Body Experience, when we go into that state, it seems that in some instances it's a more expanded form of consciousness. So it's not the same as physical consciousness, and it's also not the same as what I've seen in various different instances where it's more akin to something like a dream. But I'm hesitant to use that word because people tend to latch on to the idea of a dream and then kind of run with it. But I'm not talking about something akin to everyday types of dreams. I'm talking about something much more profound and much more like a different state of reality. But it seems that in the same way that within a dream we don't have full apprehension of our faculties, when we can believe things within a dream context that maybe we wouldn't believe in everyday life. It seems to me that to some degree in the near-death experience or the immediate state beyond physical death, if there is a continuation of consciousness of some form, it often seems to be in that somewhat hazy state where the mind, where consciousness doesn't function in the way that it does when we're fully alert and fully engaged with our physical brains in our physical bodies. So there seems to be somewhat either a diminishing of our faculties or an increase of them to a level that's far beyond what we usually comprehend. it's interesting that there doesn't seem to be an ordinary in terms of how our consciousness works on a day-to-day level. There doesn't seem to be much evidence of consciousness being the same. There definitely seems to be a shift in one direction or the other. So that would be the first thing that I would say I've noticed in terms of my out-of-body experiences, and also looking at near-death literature and looking at what I've seen with people who have encountered that kind of state. There's definitely a transformative aspect to it, that people will often lose the fear of death. They will feel that they can continue and that they can move through their lives without the usual fears or without the usual worries that most people have, because in a lot of senses they're not so attached to physical reality or to their materialistic goals that they may have had beforehand. So I think there's that aspect as well, but that doesn't really offer proof of something beyond the physical body. That just suggests that there's a positive outcome in general. There are some instances of negative out-of-body experiences and negative near-death experiences, but they are rare. They are in the kind of minority when it comes to these kinds of experiences. And when I say negative, I mean that they were somewhat fearful, but not that any actual harm came to the individual, more that just the experience was somewhat frightening or out of the ordinary. But obviously anything that's out of the ordinary can be frightening if you're not used to it, essentially. In one of the emails I was asked, what do I personally think about the idea of continuation of life after death, and what do I think of things like mediumship, for example? Do these areas offer evidence for a continuation of life after death? I think that we get into lots of tricky areas when we start to think about that, because the problem is if information is coming through from a non-physical source, let's say, or a non-sensory source, something beyond what we can ordinarily know, that doesn't necessarily equate to evidence that it's coming from a discarnate being or a spirit, a soul, whatever you prefer to call it. So we get into that situation where you can't know for sure that this is evidence, because it could be coming through some kind of psi or psychic faculty. So that's essentially the super Sai problem as it's often referred to. So this idea that things that we generally associate with the afterlife could be put down to this extended or expanded form of psi or psychic ability. So hence the term super Sai. So there's that issue. We have that really apparently when we talk about mediumship, because even within the mediumship world there is this idea of the difference between a psychic and a medium, that some mediums are believed to be working more in a psychic way, so they're picking up information, they're picking up data, if you like, they're picking up probably residual information, whereas in other instances there is the idea that it's a live interaction, that there is some form of continuing conscious being. So it's a different approach and offers evidence in a different way. So then we can look at the research, for example, of Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Research Centre. They look very closely at these kinds of things with extremely tight controls. So I think the work of Julie Beischel is definitely really, really significant in terms of offering evidence for some kind of continuation of consciousness. It's still problematic in the sense of does it confirm super Sai, or does it confirm this idea that there is a continuation of consciousness or not? I think a lot of these areas do come down to a situation of it depends on your own perspective. One person who I personally know and I've worked with is a friend of mine called Matt Dennis, who is a medium. I've known him for many years and I've seen him work in various ways with spirits, or with areas like psychometry, or reading a particular object and seeing what comes through. I find that what I've seen with him has been very convincing, very compelling. So on a personal level, there's things like that, my own out-of-body experiences, and then there's also the situation of when we encounter the evidence from near-death experiences, or when we have those types of experiences like my own shared death experience, it all pushes the evidence in the direction of confirming that there is some continuation of consciousness. Then we have the problem of a mechanism, the problem within science that would reject these ideas because we don't have really any evidence of how they could work or in what form this continuation could take place. And this is a really valid concern. So science, in many ways, pushes the weight of evidence back the other way. So we get this situation of, and when I say science, I mean more areas like physics. I think parapsychology and near-death research definitely supports the idea of a continuation of consciousness, as does parapsychology. But when we look at physics and some of these other areas, it kind of pushes the balance back the other way. So we get into this situation where it becomes an issue of defining, okay, how should we look at this? I tend to focus it on the idea of neutrality. I think my whole approach with these areas is to be quite neutral in terms of what I actually conclude to be true or not true. I don't know ultimately whether out-of-body experiences, psi, all of these things are real, but when I apply the hardest evidence I can to falsify my experiences, I haven't found a way to effectively do that. When I've taken part in scientific research, in the laboratory, it's confirmed that there's something going on, both with Dean Radin, with Rupert Sheldrake, and with John Kruth at the Rhine Research Centre. So when I've looked at these different areas and taken part in these areas myself, I can't falsify them. So that's one aspect. Then we look at the data on a whole over the last 140 plus years of research within parapsychology. Again, we do find areas that are problematic, like fraud. We do find evidence that undermines these areas, but we also find in many, many instances solid research that supports that there's some kind of continuation. We can look at the work, for example, of Dr. Penny Sartori, who I've known for many years as well, and she's taken part in workshops and things that I've done. I'm very convinced by Penny's integrity and also the importance of her work. And again, in that research, it showed evidence for a continuation of consciousness. We have areas that didn't come to as much evidence as we may have wanted, like the AWARE study, which hasn't quite come to full fruition, but there were instances within that study that again confirmed that there was some kind of continuation of consciousness. It wasn't the kind of research that we may have hoped, in the sense of finding a situation where someone went out of body and was able to perceive a particular sign or whatever while they were out of body. That would be the gold standard. Unfortunately, I personally don't really favour that kind of approach, because I think it's unlikely that someone's going to do that while they're out of body. It seems somewhat the wrong way to go. Also in my own research, looking at what I perceive while out of body, and also looking at what people in near-death experience cases perceive when they're out of body, it tends to be small three-dimensional objects. We can think of the famous denture case, for example, from Pim van Lommel's research. We can look at the famous tennis shoe, for example. We can look at Pam Reynolds, the skull drill that looked a bit like an electric toothbrush. All of these cases that we see in the literature, mostly they're seeing small three-dimensional objects. So I think that's an interesting observation that I don't know of anyone else picking up and focusing on. So I think that's very important, and we should look into ways to make the research fit what people are actually experiencing, both in out-of-body experiences and in near-death experiences. So that's important in terms of gaining evidence and learning more about the experience. So when we start to put all of these pieces of evidence together, it becomes a situation where how do we discern whether there's truth or not? If I think about the emails that I've received this week, it tends to suggest to me that people are really struggling with this same question. They're trying to understand what side of the coin they should come down with. And in some ways, I think it's unsatisfying. In some ways, I think it is a situation where we have to remain somewhat neutral. We can maybe lean more one way or the other, but to say categorically that we can know whether there is an afterlife or not is very, very difficult. But for me, on a personal level at this point, I've experienced too much in my life to completely dismiss such an idea. I've experienced so many out-of-body experiences, so many instances where things have happened that are so outside of the norm of materialistic, reductionistic science that I can't deny that. I can't dismiss that. Many skeptics have put forward the idea that, well, they've tried these things, they've tested them multiple times and they haven't found any evidence. But then there are scientists who are completely the opposite and have found evidence over and over again. And I look at my own life, it would be irrational for me to deny the things that I've experienced over the years again and again and again. Since the age of 12, even my earliest out-of-body experiences included what is called veridical experiences or objective perceptions. I was able to see things that I couldn't have seen in any ordinary sense. And that's continued throughout my life. So while that's not always possible to do, I can't do that on tap. I can't do that in every single experience. I have been able to do it in the laboratory. I have been able to perceive targets correctly. So that again suggests to me that if it can be done under scientific conditions, and we also have case studies which are different to anecdotes. This is important to highlight because an anecdote is just a story that's relayed and changes over time as people repeat it and whatever. A case study is where it is recorded and all of the information is written down at the time of the experience. And so we have an accurate, confirmed record of what took place. That's very different to an anecdote. And that's important because sometimes people skeptical of these kinds of things will dismiss any kind of near-death experience or shared death experience as simply an anecdote. That's unfair because it's the only way that we can look at these experiences. There's no other way that we can understand what someone has experienced other than asking them and recording what they say. That's our only option. So to dismiss that kind of evidence would essentially mean that we cannot investigate the area whatsoever scientifically, and that would be a real loss to science and to us as individuals. So overall, I would say, to answer the question that people really want to know, what do I personally believe? I would say that I have a high degree of confidence that there is some continuation of consciousness, but I suspect that it's not in the way that most people would imagine it and would like it to be, in the sense of a continuation in the exact same way that we interact and function on a day-to-day level. I think that our consciousness, our minds, our experience of reality changes significantly. And maybe that's towards an increase, or maybe that's somewhat more within this not fully aware type of state. It's somewhere between full consciousness and something close to unconsciousness. So I think that what we're dealing with is some kind of in-between state of consciousness that's not fully the same as physical consciousness. So that's generally what I tend to think. based upon years of experience, the research, and thinking about the topic for many, many years. I'm completely open to being wrong, and I think it would be really great if it did turn out that there are more solid pieces of evidence supporting the idea of a solid continuation of consciousness. But I think out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences in most of these areas are very different. But there's one thing that is very clear with all of these types of experiences, is that they're very, very transformative. They create a greater degree of inner peace. They create a lack of materialism, a feeling that it is more important to focus on other forms of life, the environment, human beings, non-human animals, all of these areas. It makes us more compassionate, I believe. It makes us more empathic. It makes us more at peace with ourselves and free of fear. And I think whether there is a continuation or not, that is really the beauty and the power of these experiences.